Hello everyone and welcome back to Biblical Study. In today's discussion, Jason and I are going to be talking about the divine counsel in Job, which appears in the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2. Hello Jason.
Hello Claire.
So the divine counsel first appears in Job chapter 1 verses 6 to 12, where there is an assembly of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. What made you want to discuss this today?
Well, because it's part of the Job narrative, and it's something our students would be reading as part of the research for the matric exam, and other people will also be interested in this very strange passage in the book of Job that talks about divine beings who aren't exactly what it says on the tin. Maybe you, as the Hebrew expert, would explain what I mean by not exactly what they are.
Yeah, there's definitely some very interesting translations depending on what English version of the Bible you're using. The actual Hebrew words that are used to describe the creatures or beings that gather around God in Job chapter 1 verse 6 is B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of the gods. Elohim, of course, being a Hebrew plural. We've gotten used to translating that as singularly as a word for God. But in either sense, sons, B'nai, implies a number of non-human, perhaps celestial beings that are gathering around God on this occasion. And of course, we find this in other sections of the Bible. We know that it appears, there seems to be a reference to in 1 Kings 22, a couple of the Psalms 29, 82 and 89. And also in the book of Daniel in chapter 7, there's similar references. So this idea that there's an assembly, a celestial meeting of sorts, where Job's fate is about to be discussed.
And we find this in other non-biblical sources. Anyone familiar with the Iliad, for example, will be possibly aware of the passage in the Iliad book 2, chapter 4, where it says, "Now the gods seated by the side of Zeus were holding assembly on the golden floor, and in their midst the queenly Hebe poured them nectar." This informs us that this is quite a familiar scene for polytheistic religions. We see it in Babylonian, Sumerian cultures very familiar to the biblical authors.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also known from Mesopotamian myth. We have reference to it in the Baal tablets, section 3. I'm afraid I don't have a quote to hand, but if you want to find out more about that, you can check out Frank Cross's Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Bible. And
the Canaanites, of course, would have been very close to the Israelites and the Judeans.
Yes. So we've established that this isn't unique to the book of Job, this type of setup. But what actually happens on this occasion?
Well, what we're looking at here looks like a setting of a play or a drama. The authors are setting a familiar scene to readers of the time, using a very well-known device of using the gods as tools to draw out truth and story from the lives of biblical protagonists, in this case, the hero Job.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that sort of narrative aspect to it, because when we were doing a little bit of reading in advance of our discussion, I kept being reminded of this scene in one of Terry Pratchett's books. I want to say it was The Colour of Magic, but I can't be exactly certain. But there is a scene where the fates, almost these type of celestial beings, kind of has like a vibe with the Greek pantheon, maybe, are playing some kind of dice game up in the heavens, and it's impacting on the characters like Rincewind down below in Ankh-Morpork, and what actually happens to them to move the story forward.
Well, isn't this exactly the same scene as we see in another Terry Pratchett novel, Thud, where the gods or divine beings are playing a board game that affects the lives of people down below?
That might be the one I'm thinking of. It's kind of like a version of Nefertafel, the Viking type of Viking chess, yeah. So what's particularly noteworthy about this occasion in Job chapter 1, of course, is the appearance of Hasatan.
Oh,
let's talk about Hasatan.
We should have some scary background music, because the English translation is Satan.
Satan. Of course, in the Hebrew, it's Hasatan, ha being the article. So what we're literally looking at here are the words the Satan. Now, Satan, of course, there's a little bit of wordplay going on. Satan appears to come from the verb sin, tet, nun. So those are your 3 Hebrew root letters. And that would be to obstruct or to oppose. So that's where we get the common understanding of Hasatan as the adversary. But of course, there's also a little bit of Hebrew wordplay going on, as it can also be associated with and is sometimes played off with in other sections of the Hebrew Bible with suit. Completely different Hebrew root letters, samek, vav, tav, meaning to incite or to instigate. And it's interesting that Norman Habel, in his commentary on Job, actually describes this scene as being the catalyst which initiates the plot. The fact that the Lord boasts about how upright Job is, this boast about Job's character is the catalyst which initiates the plot in Habel's interpretation of this scene. So Satan appears to be the adversary, the counsel for the prosecution in a lot of scholarly interpretations, but also the instigator, the agent that sort of incites towards action. And of course, in this case, action that's detrimental to Job.
So if we consider this a courtroom scene, this is a divine council, a divine courtroom where we have this image of the God of Israel sitting in the seat of judgment, then Satan has a role in this. As one of the sons of the gods.
Absolutely.
Has a role to play, and he is there to be the accuser or the prosecution, but also has a side role, possibly you're saying, as the agent provocateur.
Yes, which would be a play on the second Hebrew root, samek, vav, tav. It's interesting. Satan is definitely, for want of a better phrase, Satan is part of the furniture.
Of course.
I'm gendering Hasatan here, describing him as he, but obviously in this context, Hasatan is a type of celestial being, perhaps some form of angel. Hasatan is questioned, not as to what are you doing here, but where have you been? Where have you come from? And he responds to God by saying, Mesut ba'aretz u mehit halekbach. I have come Mesut ba'aretz, from roving about upon the earth, u mehit halekbach, and from going to and fro upon it. So I'm giving a very literal translation here, and I have a little confession to make. The reason that I tend to teach my students this chapter of Job, specifically chapter 1, verses 1 to 12, is because it provides 2 great examples of a particular verb form called a hitpa'el. And that's what we encounter here with mehit halek. Hit halek meaning to go to and fro. This implies that Satan is almost functioning as some kind of surveyor or monitoring agency, almost like, the divine secret intelligence, going back and forth upon the earth and finding out what's happening. And of course, this prompts God to turn around to Satan and say, oh, have you considered my servant Job? Now, of course, the phrase, have you considered my servant Job, is how it's very commonly translated for the ease of transmission. But of course, the phrase that God actually uses is particularly interesting. So when God turns around to Satan and says, where have you been? Satan responds, oh, I've been roving about the earth and going back and forth upon her. God turns around and says, Ha samata levacha, have you inclined your heart? So the literal translation is, have you inclined or directed, have you set your heart towards my servant Job? So Satan has a heart. Now, this is very different from our more medieval understanding of Satan as, this pure, evil, malevolent force. Here, in God's words, he's being credited with having a heart, which of course in the classical Hebrew imagination, the heart is the seat of the intellect, the will, the feeling, the knowledge, and the capacity for reflection. So what God is asking here is, has Satan inclined or set his heart or his intellect towards Job? So that's why it's translated as, have you considered my servant Job?
And it's funny that you should mention this, because the question of evil is a central question of the book of Job. And as an aside, the question of evil doesn't revolve around the character of Satan in the book of Job. The question of evil and the cause of evil is directed towards God.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, any sense of competition or argument between Hasatan and the Lord in this part of the book of Job seems to be more or less resolved, not by anything that Hasatan achieves or anything that God declares, but by Job's own resignation to his circumstances. Because, of course, after chapter 2, Hasatan disappears from the narrative completely.
Yes. In fact, it could certainly be argued that God is the source of evil in the text, and Job admits as much to his wife. Can we accept good from the Lord if we don't also accept evil or bad? Can the God who blesses not also curse? And this is very problematic for modern readers of the text, who are familiar with the idea of natural evil and spiritual evil for those of a religious imagination.
The question of suffering comes up a lot in Job. And there is certainly a sense, particularly for the modern contemporary reader, that the conclusions, to the extent that the book offers any conclusions at all, is quite dissatisfactory. And that is a question in an exam context in the university that we see coming up quite often, whether or not the book offers any satisfactory solution to the issue as to why the just suffer, in sort of colloquial terms, why do bad things happen to good people? Comes up repeatedly in an exam context, at least. It's interesting that you mentioned Job's wife. In certain interpretations, she herself is seen as instrument of Satan, which is quite a typical interpretation of a woman's role in history. You do come across it, that the women as agents of temptation, and of course Job's wife could be considered here to be an agent of Satan insofar as she offers the temptation towards despair.
Well, she does get referred to as a fallen woman. There is a response that Job gives to his wife. I use that term fallen woman quite humorously here. But when she asks Job, will you not just curse God to his face and die? Job's response is, you're talking like any foolish woman. And the Hebrew there doesn't just mean idiot or fool or, an unintelligent person. It says, you're speaking like a harlot, like a fallen woman.
Yes.
So this image in the wife is very interesting.
Yes.
But getting back to the divine council and the furniture of this council, we have this central character of Satan. And I wanted to pick a bone with you because you referred to Satan like one of the angels, but the Hebrew text doesn't contain this at all.
No.
In fact, angels are completely absent. The reading I have of the text is that these in themselves are gods in their own right.
Certainly. There's a sense in the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim that these are divine beings in their own right. And certain commentators have connected this phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim to sort of the primordial era of creation that we encounter in Genesis 6.
I was reading Psalm 82, and in 82 verse 1 we come across this amazing line about the divine council. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And what makes this fascinating, and I'm not the expert, you are the Hebrew expert here, but in the limited understanding of the Hebrew that I have, what makes this interesting is that in both occasions, the gods in the two parts of this sentence are referred to by the exact same word, Elohim. So, God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, Elohim, he holds judgment. There is no attempt in these texts to cover over or wash away the polytheism. These are polytheistic texts speaking about a divine council, about a pantheon of gods that would have been as native to Canaanite religion and culture as it was to the very earliest forms of Israelite religion.
Yeah, Yeah, in fact, my use of the word angels or angelic earlier was misplaced. And the reason for that is I'm speaking from a context that has been influenced over the years by further development. And that's made particularly clear by the scholar Elaine Pagels in her article, The Social History of Satan, in which she describes Hasatan as this intimate enemy, sort of an insider. She points out that over time, this idea of evil and the development of the process of demonology and angelology, some of that has to be put down to the actual Greek translation. Of course, in the Hebrew, when there's a mention of divine messengers, the word malachim is used. However, in the Septuagint, the term gets translated into versions of angelos, which is where we, of course, get the word angel. So when we talk about the use of the word Elohim, I don't want to get sort of too sidetracked down into a debate about the appropriateness or otherwise of the documentary hypothesis, but in very simple terms, we do have the designations J, P, E, and D, and of course the E in that setup stands for Elohist, this strand within the biblical text, which is very visible again in places like Genesis, of this preponderance of the term Elohim being used in reference to God. And of course, again, we see it in Psalm 82. So we know that there were certain schools or perhaps even individuals within the population of biblical authors who were more than happy to continue using this word Elohim. And that's one of the markers we use to identify that type of text.
Is it, do you think, that they are more than happy to use this? Or might it be the case that this is an earlier memory of Canaanite Israelite religion? Is the earliest form of Judaism that we are familiar with in the earliest history of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah, is this an evolution of wider polytheistic, perhaps Canaanite religion?
Definitely when it comes to parts of the Torah where it is dominant, and for example, I'd go back to like the creation and flood narratives as we find them in the book of Genesis, yes. However, when it comes to the book of Job, we're on much less solid ground. And the reason I say that is because there are elements of the book of Job that appear to be much later, much more heavily influenced by a sort of Hellenistic environment rather than the earlier Canaanite environment from which we would get phrases like Elohim and of course Baal, which over time in the Hebrew lexicon becomes synonymous simply with the word Lord or Master. Many people from a Hasidic context would be familiar with the character of the Baal Shem Tov. In that Hasidic context, in the early modern period, is not in any way a reference to the Mesopotamian god Baal, but of course the linguistic root of that word, Baal, is Canaanite.
Of course, yes. And that is what makes this scene, the Divine Council, so captivating for a modern reader who is conditioned by this idea of monotheism and the singularity of God through Jewish and Christian and, of course, Islamic culture, that when we read these older texts that contain, and even though, yes, the Book of Job comes from a later period, possibly late Persian, early Hellenistic, as you pointed out, it contains what I would describe as the culture memory of older forms of religion. And we all do this in our popular language. We make references or we make linguistic cues to older belief systems and older ways of speaking. And this is exactly what is happening here in the Book of Job. But it does then perhaps inform us that this type of monotheism is itself a development. It hasn't always been monotheist.
No, I agree with you there. And I think the fact that the Divine Council appears as a motif, not just in Job, but in a little bit in Kings and certainly in a number of the Psalms, indicates that monotheism, as fundamental and far-reaching as a development as it is, did not emerge from a vacuum. That it appears to be a development that's very much founded on earlier polytheistic contexts and elements of which we still incorporate into our what we would consider conventional monotheistic approaches.
So the big question is, who's the bad guy here? You know, that when,
hard.
of course, when modern readers read, you know, and Satan rocked up, you know, first of all, you know, we have this, on one day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. The modern reader knows exactly what's happening here, that they, you know, we're in heaven, that God, the same God that we read about in Genesis, in the creation, that, you know, God, you know, the man himself is sitting on the seat. We expect everything to be hunky-dory. This is the heaven of perfection. And it's not even the very next sentence, it's the next part of the same sentence. And then Satan rocks up, and the Lord, as you said, the Lord is in first name terms with him. How you, old boy? Where have you been? Oh, I've been snooping about, I've been up and down, I've been around the place, I've been around a bit. These two characters, if we can treat God in this scene and Satan in this scene, are on first name terms. They're buddies. They know one another. There is clearly a seniority thing going on because it's the Lord who sits there in judgment. And I think it's interesting that you pointed out that Satan is the eyes and ears of God. So God is really asking, what God is really asking for here is a report. So, you're back. Yeah, I'm back. What have you seen? What can you tell me? And then God shows off this great deal of conceit. And here I'm going to show off, because this is what I was teaching my students this year, is the threefold conceit. God shows his conceit as a character in the text. He says, have you seen my servant Job? Have you inclined your heart to him? Have you paid him any attention? He's great. He's the most perfect. He's the most brilliant. He's the greatest man alive. And God is showing a great deal of pride in this character Job. And then the conceit of Satan is to use this against God, is to use his boast as a weakness in what amounts to a bet. He puts it up to God. He says, does Job love you for nothing? Does he serve you for nothing? You've made his life peachy. He's rich. He's secure in the land. Your blessing, your favour has made it much easier for him to be a good guy. Just take all his wealth away. And God accepts the bet. And as we read, as the text unfolds, this is a really cruel bet. And it's not Satan who does it. So, in a sense, we might be able to read this like the Garden of Eden, where the serpent, who isn't Satan, and where we're not told that this is Satan, or indeed a devil, that the serpent in the garden says to Eve, did God really say this? You know, I dare you to try it, you know. And this is what we see Satan do in this passage, is he says, you know, I dare you to take his wealth and watch him crumble. And then in the second divine council scene in chapter 2, it's, I dare you to destroy his health, his life, his well-being. It's not Satan who takes the fruit of the tree. It's not Satan or the serpent who eats it. And it's not Satan in this passage who does any of this to Job. It's all with permission. It's a divine instruction. Go and do this to him. God doesn't come out of the book of Job well.
God certainly doesn't come out of the book of Job, the first two chapters of the book of Job, particularly well. You could argue that the later chapters, which of course I know we're going to leave to a further discussion.
But I will argue that point. He doesn't come out of the later chapters well either.
Well, you could argue that the later chapters are a kind of PR exercise in sort of flexing.
An editorial PR exercise, because when God finally answers out of the whirlwind in what is by far my most favourite text of the Hebrew Bible, what God answers is utterly appalling. We have millions and millions and millions of chapters. I exaggerate a little, but Job is a long book. We have a lot of chapters of dialogue of this descent into suffering and pain and the experience of evil and how miserable and lonely and isolated Job is, to the point where he curses the day of his birth. Why was I not taken from my mother's womb straight to the grave, if only darkness fell on the day of my conception? This is a suicidal character. Things are very bad. He asks God for an answer. At length, God answers. And God's answer is, have you noticed how brilliant I am?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that I made the mountains and the sky and the heavens? He doesn't answer. No apology. He doesn't say, I am sorry, Job. It was a bet. I'm sorry you were the brunt of it. And Job's reward is he gets his family back. He gets to have more children and he gets more wealth. But yeah, one child isn't really a replacement for the loss of how many others? 10. He lost 10 children as part of a bet, and God just replaces them with other children. God does not come out of the book of Job very well.
No. No, you could argue that Satan comes off a little bit better, in fact. And one of the reasons that I say that is because Satan, Hasatan, is very much presented as being where he belongs and functioning within a system that he is very much part of. And the reason that I say that is because when we move to chapter 2 and the second Divine Council episode, we find that in chapter 2, verse 1, Hasatan, in the Hebrew, is represented as also having come to present himself before the Lord, just like B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, in chapter 1. And remember my favorite verb construction from this example, the hitpalel, we get that again when the sons of God in chapter 1 have come lahit ya'atsev, to set or station oneself, to assemble, to take one hand, to present themselves before the Lord. And this lahit ya'atsev is the same verb applied to Hasatan in chapter 2. This further emphasizes his belonging and that he's there functioning as part of the divine council. However, this phraseology does not appear in the Greek version of the text, so there is some debate as to whether this occurrence with reference to Hasatan in chapter 2 is a later Hebrew addition, and perhaps that the Greek version, the shorter version without this verb construction, is in some sense more authentic. But of course, we could go back and forth about that all day. We don't have any definitive proof one way or the other. But it is interesting that in the second Divine Council episode, Satan is very much presented as having come to present himself before the Lord as part of the Council of Heaven.
So what you're saying here is that this is where the Satan belongs, that he's doing his job correctly, and that perhaps, if we are to trust the Hebrew, that the original understanding of this is a true Hebrew understanding of the place of the Satan in this council.
Yeah. That he is a functionary within the divine assembly. And I think that that's further reinforced by the fact that it is God is the one who has the final say. There is a clear hierarchical relationship here, and it is God who, in chapter 2, turns around. In chapter 1, he turns around and says, all that he has is in your hand. So he gives over all of Job's personal property, his family, his crops, his animals, etc., gives them over into the hand of Satan to do with what he will. And then in chapter 2, when the testing of Job is extended even unto Job's own physical person, God's only caveat is that Job's life cannot be taken from him.
Well, it certainly draws into focus this understanding of the omniscience of God. God asks the Satan, have you considered my servant Job? If God knows everything, then God wouldn't need to ask this question. If God knows everything, then God didn't need to take this bet and destroy Job's life. So we have an echo here of a pantheon in which the gods themselves are limited. That this God sitting in judgment in the throne room relies on, as you pointed out at the very beginning, the Satan as the eyes and ears of God. He sends him out to spy, to go forth, or to go to and fro upon the earth and come back with a report. He is the intelligence of God, in that respect anyway. And if we think about this in terms of a Greek or a later Greek understanding of the text and how that changes the meaning, perhaps the Greek is seeing this again like the Iliad sees this text, with Zeus sitting on a throne of, on the golden pavement, on a seat of judgment, and Hades comes into his presence and gives Zeus, Zeus can be tricked, and this happens again and again in the Homeric literature, is Zeus and the other gods are fooled. You can pull the wool over their eyes, you can trick them. And there seems to be a little bit of this happening in the Job text here in the Divine Council. Does Job love you for nothing? Satan is putting it up to God in order to trick God into doing something, in a sense, and God does it. So this, in a very real way, this God is not compatible with the God of Judaism today or Christianity today. This is a limited God as at the head of a pantheon. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I think that the limitations of God in this story are illustrated by his reliance on functionaries.
So why is God presented like this? And before we close, because we don't want to go on all day, but before we close, I'd like to know your thoughts on why God is presented like this in the book of Job.
Off the top of my head, I imagine that God is presented in this manner in the book of Job in order to attempt, not perhaps successfully, but definitely in order to attempt to answer the type of age-old questions that continue to plague humans right up to today, and that were very common in the discourse of wisdom literature in the Near East at the time. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the just suffer? I mean, this is something that Job brings up himself in his lamentations and also in his discussions with his less than helpful friends who we'll encounter in the later chapters. But I think that the reason for God's presentation, as dissatisfactory as it is, and particularly for those of us who are reading it from a more modern monotheistic approach to the nature of God, I think that as dissatisfactory as the final result might be for us, the impetus for the creation of this presentation of God certainly comes from what was exercising the minds of thinkers, writers, and philosophers in the ancient world.
I think that was an excellent answer.
It's a political answer.
Well, I think we should stop there.
Thank you to everybody for joining us today on our sort of little meander through just these first 2 chapters of the Book of Job. We'll certainly be coming back to this because there's plenty more to talk about throughout the middle and also the end of the book, including some pretty climactic scenes that probably belong in the Hollywood archives somewhere.
Oh, yes. Skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Jason. Talk to you soon.
Bye.